that thing. You press my button. I'm wild about that thing.
Welcome back to the show, Josina, Morita. So long since we've seen you. Josina is Metropolitan Water Reclamation District Commissioner, an urban planner, a community organizer, also now a mom and friend of the show. Josina, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you guys, even via Zoom.
I know. Likewise. Since we had you on the last on the show, and it was in person back in the studio, you became a mother. Congratulations!
Thank you. Of two now. That's how long it's been.
And like another close family member of mine, you've had two under two in the COVID period.
Yeah, a little crazy.
I reckon. How does being a parent now affect your work life at the reclamation district, or if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives you a whole nother perspective on life and why this work is so urgent. I think it's also taught me to work smarter, right? I think as moms, we learn to multitask. And the amount that I can get done when the kid naps for 15 minutes, is what I used to maybe get done in half a day. You just learn to make it work.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Josina, we've had a mass murder in Atlanta, an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. How is the Asian American community viewing all of this, and what's been the reaction?
It was such a awful thing that happened in Atlanta. The murders themselves, of course, are awful. But I think we've also seen the response from the deputy sheriff in Atlanta kind of denying that it was a hate crime. We've seen the media humanize the shooter more than they've humanized the victims. And so it's been an added kind of insult to injury, that we've seen, but it's not something that has necessarily been new to the Asian American community. I think that maybe one of the things that has come out of this has been a reckoning both within the Asian American community about who we are, and a lot of the silence that we've had in our community about the racism that we experience. I've seen literally thousands of people start to tell their stories on Facebook of being harassed, being ching-chonged, being asked persistently, where are you from? Underhanded compliments about being, sexualized as Asian American women. So I think it's been a real conversation about racism and misogyny within the community. And I think it's been a reckoning externally for a lot of Americans for the first time, really seeing what anti-Asian racism looks like. I think that there has been this perception that anti-Asian racism is somehow less violent, less urgent than other forms of racism. And I think that this has been a real awakening for a good portion of the country to see these murders and to really step up and say, okay, I see anti-Asian racism. I see Asian Americans beyond the model minority myth, my friendly neighbor who smiles and doesn't, kind of grits their teeth through the sideways comments. And so I am hopeful that, as awful as the situation has been, that there is a lot of transformation and growth and good that can come out of this situation, both within the Asian American community, but also externally.
Josina, Morita, can you share with us who makes up the Asian American community, and where do people come from, and what's the history, is what I'm asking, of immigration to the U.S. when people came from the Philippines, et cetera, to Hawaii, California? And there is a thing called the exclusion era, which I didn't know about. Maybe tell us about that.
Sure. I mean, I am 6th generation Chinese, 5th generation Japanese American. My family has been in this country since the 1850s. And so we have seen throughout the history of this country waves of anti-Asian hate, waves of scapegoating of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, and waves of really racialized policy in this country. So, the Chinese Exclusion Act was targeted specifically to stop Chinese immigration, even though we were recruited here really to come to work as laborers, to build the Transcontinental Railroad, to work in coal mines. As a Japanese American, my family, my grandmother who's still alive was in internment camps and scapegoated during World War II, held in 120,000 Japanese Americans held in internment camps by the US government for years with no charges and no convictions ever. The things that they were accused of. Filipino farm workers were the founders of the United Farm Workers in California. There's so much diversity in the Asian American community. We come from, dozens of countries, speak even more languages. We have different histories as to how and why we came to this country, a lot of it having to do with war, right? So fleeing wars, whether it be, the Vietnam War, the Cambodian, genocide, things like that have pushed Asian immigration in different ways, along with, of course, just economic hardship in home countries and kind of pull factors to the idea of the American dream here in this country. And so here in Illinois, we are the fastest growing population in the state, percentage-wise. We, for the history of Illinois until just, 10 years ago, really didn't have Asian Americans in elected office. I chair the Asian American Caucus. For years, we had an Asian American caucus with no Asians in it. We elected our first Asian American countywide, which was me, and our first Asian American in the General Assembly, Teresa Ma, in 2016. And I now chair a caucus of 9. And it's amazing, especially in this moment where we're talking about anti-Asian hate and, anti-Asian racism. Just 5 years ago, all 9 members of my caucus were not elected. So our progress is really palpable in this moment. I'm really proud of our caucus members to have, stood up to run, to win, and now really being voices in this really important moment for our community.
Josina, you mentioned the United Farm Workers being co-founders of the United Farm Workers, Filipino farm workers being part of United Farm Workers. And I wondered if you could expound upon that a little bit and talk about the intersection of the struggle for Asian rights in America with other civil rights movements, be they Black, Latino, women, etc.
Absolutely. Both of my parents were part of the Filipino farm worker organizations. My mom worked at Agbayani Village, which was a health clinic that was built for Filipino farm workers. She worked with Philip Veracruz and a lot of the Filipino farm worker leaders in Delano, California, who helped build the United Farm Workers, right, which is most famously known for Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. But Filipinos were a really big part of building that organization. And it's also a way, I think, that we look throughout history. There's a long history of Asian Americans in the labor movement. My cousin, Kent Wong, was the founder of Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. We have a PALA chapter now here, help the Secretary Treasurer of the Chicago Federation of Labor is Filipino, Don Villar, here. And so there's been a long history of class solidarity, but also racial solidarity between Asian Americans and other communities. So that's an example of Filipinos and largely Mexican immigrant populations. And I think it's been a powerful moment for us right now to as Asian Americans, for the first time, for a lot of people, seeing African American, Latino, white populations, communities standing with us in this moment. And I think it's a really important moment for our community to then recognize what our responsibility is to stand with other communities. For me, as an Asian American who's married to an African American, right, I can believe in supporting Asian women and supporting Black lives at the same time. And I think these connections are essential. We have a long history, particularly of Asian American and Black solidarity. 2 of my heroes, Yuri Kochiyama was part of the Harlem family, movement in New York with Malcolm X. If you've seen, of course, the awful picture of Malcolm X, when he was assassinated, she's the one holding him. There is an Asian American woman, Yuri Kochiyama, And she made those connections as somebody who grew up in the internment camps as a young child, to the struggles of Black communities in New York. And Grace Lee Boggs, who was a leader with particularly Black union workers, Black auto workers in Detroit.
Right.
So there's a long history there, and we hope to continue it.
Wow,
Good.
that is, thank you so much for sharing what you just did, Josina. It's moving to me
And it's what we wanted to hear.
to recognize that what you just said 5 years ago to now, we now have an actual caucus of Asian American elected officials. And when Theresa Ma was interviewed last year at the start of the COVID reaction, which unfortunately targeted Asian Americans thanks to then President number 45, I don't say his name, creating the baloney that he did around the China virus, was really the initial, for a lot of people who are not Asian American, initial reality that Asian Americans can and are targeted as well. So, I mean, the history you just shared, which is a small piece of it, is so rich and so important. I can't thank you enough. I'm going to pull you back to your day job for a second.
One thing, can I add real quick?
Yeah.
I think to that point, Asian American history is incredibly important and it's something that we don't learn. Even as Asian Americans, we don't learn our own family history. Is like the most powerful story to me was Fred Korematsu, who famously challenged the internment. His daughter didn't know what he did until she read it in a textbook in high school and went home and said, "Is this you?"
Amazing.
And so we are working on a bill. The Asian American Caucus, Representative Jennifer Gong Gershowitz and Senator Ron Billabalam has sponsored a bill, the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History Act, that will require Asian American history in Illinois high school curriculum. And we're doing an event this Saturday to kind of educate people about Asian American history and the TEACH Act. So those who are interested in joining, you can find our event on Facebook. The Asian American Caucus Facebook page. It's this Saturday from 2 to 3:30, and we welcome everybody to join us.
That's today, as far as this.
Yes, well, today at 2:30 or 2 o'clock.
Let me ask a question. I don't think we mentioned our senator when we talked about all the elected Asian American officials.
So he's part of our caucus. So our caucus is made up of 4 Asian American women who are elected in the General Assembly. We got Theresa Ma, Jennifer Gong Gershowitz, Denise Wang Stoneback in Skokie, and Janet Yang Roar, who was just elected in Naperville. And Ron Billabalam is our first South Asian in the General Assembly, and our only Asian American state senator. He's my state senator. I was proud to chair his campaign, and he's a fellow brother in the Asian American labor movement, comes from SCIU.
How about Tammy Duckworth?
Right. So our caucus is local and state level folks, but of course we are so proud to have Tammy Duckworth as our U.S. Senator and Raja Krishnamurthy as one of our Congress people from the Illinois delegation.
Right.
So I'm gonna go back to your day job, one of your day jobs. As a mother, you have 2 day jobs and night jobs for that matter. I am fascinated by the involvement of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District in tracing COVID in wastewater and what's happening with that. Just briefly before we let you go, because
we're part of a number of pilot research studies. You know, we're one of the largest water treatment agencies in the world. And so it's been an honor to be part of these research studies, to be part of the solution, right? I mean, so some interesting facts about COVID and wastewater is that COVID can be traced in wastewater much sooner than it can in your blood. So it's a really important early detection system. It also doesn't require people to go and get, actual testing. If you can build those sensors and do that testing in the wastewater pipes, you can test for larger swaths of people at one time. So one interesting model is some universities are doing it in their dorms. Right. So they can know days before any one person can go get a blood test if anybody in that dorm or anybody who's visited that dorm has COVID. And so there's some really exciting technology as we think about, there is no such thing as a post-COVID world, right? It's how do we move forward smarter? And this is one of the things that I think will be a real norm and a tool moving forward to have a more proactive, smarter system for detecting COVID that doesn't necessarily disrupt everybody's daily life, but it's just built into our infrastructure.
I have a feeling you just sort of partially answered this question, but we've been asking everybody before we let them go, since so much inequity in services and reach have been exposed in our sad response to COVID. What are you hoping we succeed in either leaving behind with this chapter, or you just answered part of it, of using more of, which is the science that you just described, moving forward?
I mean, as somebody who works in infrastructure, I think understanding the role that providing proactive investments in communities of color, in low-income communities, to ensure that there are not just the physical infrastructure of stormwater, wastewater, but the infrastructure of resources, the infrastructure of communication and information. I think that we've learned from COVID that doing things the same old way produces the same old inequities, and that it really does take intentionality. It takes investment to do things equitably. And I hope that some of the lessons and approaches that we've learned during COVID are things that we can take into how we do everything in government, and government in particular, but across the board, understanding that we have to work smarter and we have to work fairer, and that it takes some serious intent. It's something that we have to choose to do every day.
Wow. Josina Morita, what a pleasure, what an honor to have you with us today. Everything you've shared with us is so important. We're going to go out to a beautiful Ella Jenkins singing Wade in the Water in your honor. And we're so lucky you're there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It's great to see you guys.
We'll be again together. So
We'll see you soon.
yeah, peace.
Thanks.
Wading in the water, wading in the water, children, wading in the water. God is gonna trouble these waters, wading in the water, wading in the water, children, wading in the water. God is gonna trouble these waters. See that band all dressed in white. God is gonna trouble these waters. It looked like a band of the Israelites. God is gonna trouble these waters. Wading in the water, wading in the water, children, wading in the water. God is gonna